Could there be dragons living beneath Yellowstone? Few landmarks in Yellowstone National Park are more infamous than its geysers. An estimated 500 such features can be found within its borders, the densest concentration of active geysers anywhere on planet Earth, encompassing about half of all known examples in the world. Along with the geysers, the geothermal activity underneath Yellowstone fuels various other sites, from hot springs to boiling pools of mud. After feeling the massive heat and plumes of steam arising from these same locations, early settlers to the area were inspired by mythical stories of terrifying reptilian beasts and lent these feature names like Dragon's Mouth Spring and Black Dragon Cauldron. But such creatures may not be as mythical as we might think, especially in Yellowstone National Park. You see, the July 30th, 1886 edition of Virginia's Alexandria Gazette carried a surprising story borrowed from Cinnabar, Montana's pioneer press. The story claimed that two tourists had hired a stagecoach driver to escort them through Yellowstone. Along the way, they were shocked to spot a massive shape, around 30 feet long, passing through some of the tall grass near Yellowstone Lake. The tourists said it resembled a gigantic reptile. In fact, so tall that it carried its head 10 to 15 feet above the ground, suspended on a long neck. The entire time, the beast exuded a sinister hissing sound. The tourists immediately reported their sighting to the park authorities, and a search party was now organized overnight to pursue the beast. Now, according to the Alexandria Gazette, Colonel David W. Ware, superintendent of the park, and his assistant, park guide captain Jack Barnett, led a posse of hunters deep into the wilderness. They made their way to Yellowstone Lake, where they eventually stumbled upon a cave alongside an extinct geyser. Now, the men reportedly heard the insidious hiss themselves moments before a large reptilian head struck out from the cave and stretched at least 15 feet beyond the entrance before immediately recoiling. It's easy, perhaps even wise, to view such a story within the context of the era's lax journalistic standards. Newspapers were by no means above publishing fabricated falsehoods to increase sales, so there also doesn't seem to have been any sort of follow-up to this fantastic story. Now, certainly such a discovery would have prompted hordes of hunters to descend upon Yellowstone in an attempt to capture said creature. However, researcher John LeMay looked into the details of this very 1886 story and uncovered many aspects lending to its credibility. You see, both Ware and Barnett were actually people serving in Yellowstone National Park at this time. Barnett actually built and operated the very first bridge across the Yellowstone River in 1871, and his name event lent to a mountain, Barnett Peak. David W. Ware, on the other hand, was indeed the park superintendent during those years and was credited with being a thoroughly honest man, later becoming a United States congressman. Of course, your mileage may vary today on whether or not Congress members and honesty go hand in hand, but that's besides the point. Perhaps someday in the future, scientists will discover the bones of a dinosaur in the furthest recesses of a long-forgotten cave in Yellowstone National Park, and declare the remains too recent to be fossils, because until then, we are left wondering whether Yellowstone's dragon was fact or fiction. If there is a cave hiding a dragon by Yellowstone Lake, one can reasonably see how such a feature might go unnoticed. Yellowstone Lake is the largest body of water in the park, with 110 miles of shoreline. Beyond the shore, however, a handful of islands pop up above the waves. One of the more significant sites is Stevenson Island, which stretches about 820 feet wide and is just over a mile long. The island was named in honor of Colonel James D. Stevenson, an executive officer with the U.S. Geological Survey who helped explore Yellowstone National Park in 1871. You see, it was during this period that settlers first reached the shore of what would later become known as Stevenson Island, and eventually, a 60,500 passenger steamboat christened the E.C. Waters began offering tours of Yellowstone Lake in 1905. It promised to be a lucrative plan. Unfortunately, this opportunity was doomed from the start. The steamboat's owner and Yellowstone National Park authorities constantly butted heads after customers began complaining about his attitude and his treatment of the wildlife. He was denied a license to operate the EC waters as a passenger ferry. So, his only choice was to then leave it docked at the Stevenson Island until the matter could be further settled. To make matters worse, the ice that forms over a majority of Yellowstone Lake in the winter months meant that the boat could only reliably operate from June to November. But in 1906, the owner of the EC waters hired a caretaker to watch his investment during the off-season, a duty which included occasional checkups on the vessel moored at Stevenson Island. The caretaker set off in his rowboat towards Stevenson Island one winter day, but the effort proved too much. Rowing was difficult enough on its own, but the strain of breaking the ice to reach the island gave the caretaker a heart attack, and he died on the way. No one was able to maintain the EC waters, and over the remaining months, the steamboat fell into disrepair. The owner left it moored at Stevenson Island, where it simply just rotted away. The wreck was pushed ashore in 1921 and picked over in the coming years. The boiler was removed to heat a hotel, its hull used as a makeshift shelter for skiers, and later as an awning for a fish fry business that operated during the warmer months. It also began hosting late-night parties and the fights which would inevitably break out. In fact, one such brawl took place in the summer of 1929. A park ranger had his easygoing morning shift interrupted by his supervisor, who had asked him to check on the welfare of a group of drinkers who had set up on Stevenson Island the night before. There had been reports of fighting, and the supervisor wanted to make sure that nobody was stranded, or even worse, lay out bleeding in the shadow of the wrecked steamboat. The morning was warm and pleasant, and the ranger happily hustled down to the marina to procure one of the official boats used to patrol Yellowstone Lake. The trip to Stevenson Island from the shore was a brief one during the summer months, so the ranger arrived at the shoreline in short order. Now, immediately, the ranger could see the telltale signs of partiers. Trash was strewn everywhere on shore, including empty beer bottles, some of which bobbed lazily in the water, and the wake from the ranger's boat set the glass containers into a frenzy as he pulled it up to the steamboat's creaking remains and disembarked. He had a lot of work ahead of him, so he began grabbing as much trash as possible. Now, once this task was complete, the ranger peered into the wreck of the EC waters. Luckily, no one seemed to have been left behind from the previous night's party. However, it was entirely possible that some inebriated partygoers had wandered down the shore. The ranger was forced to check the entirety of Stevenson Island, which, while not huge, would still require a bit of effort. The ranger's cheerful mood had dissipated by mid-morning. His search failed to turn up any stragglers, and the only thing he had to show for it was sweat, exhaustion, and a grumpy disposition. Satisfied at the thoroughness of his search, the ranger set back toward the beach where his patrol boat waited. As he reached the top of a small rise, however, a wind gust of staggering strength nearly threatened to knock the ranger off his feet. The air was turned cold, almost freezing, and the once placid waters of Yellowstone Lake had become a rolling boil of white caps. Now here's where things get crazy. This massive, dark thunderhead pressed forward in the sky towards Stevenson Island. And that was when the ranger spotted something floating in the shallows, something he had never noticed on his search. It was the shape of a person, big and bulky. The ranger's heart leapt into his throat, realizing there had indeed been someone injured the night before, and the time was of the essence. He fumbled with his radio, prepared to tell the rescue team that a partygoer had fallen from the steamboat wreckage into the water, hitting their head on the way down, potentially drowning. The only sound that greeted the ranger's frantic call was the blank hiss of static. He knew he had to do something, so he wades into the shallow water where the body floated face down. As he dropped to his knees, the ranger noticed that the clothing on the body didn't seem modern at all. Instead, he was looking at a man who would have been right at home in the days before Yellowstone became a national park. He was dressed like a quintessential explorer or fur trapper. Was this a ghost? Surely not. The ranger was actually able to reach out and check the man for a pulse. He was dead. The ranger flipped the corpse onto its back, facing the sky. The sight was grotesque. Bulging brown eyes goggled at him from a ghastly blue-white face of a drowning victim. And then, so quickly, The ranger said it took place in between one breath and the next. The body was simply gone. The ranger's hands, which had been moments before held the thick furs of an old-fashioned jacket, now grasped empty air. Bewildered, he staggers backwards onto the shore and falls on the sand, staring at the vacant spot. He's trying to gather his thoughts, and the ranger noted that the scene around him had also changed as well. Gone was the thundercloud, as was the wind, leaving Yellowstone Lake peaceful once again. He no longer felt cold, but instead the refreshing warmth of the sun caressed his face. Had the body somehow drifted away suddenly? The ranger scoured the waters beyond Stevenson Island, but nothing seemed out of place like before. Now, fighting off a panic attack, he tried to take stock of what had only happened, but the only thing that could explain the entire ordeal were that he had encountered a ghost, or that he had somehow miraculously slipped back in time for a brief moment to the immediate aftermath of an undocumented tragedy. The ranger rushed to his boat, hopped in, making a direct line back to the mainland. Now, the following year, the Park Service decided to put an end to the late-night drinking parties on Stevenson Island. They were done. They soaked the wreck of the EC waters in kerosene, leaving behind a charred hole clinging to the barest metal framework. Cannibals were also a problem with Yellowstone at one point, for you see, on July 11th, 1970, law enforcement officers received a phone call from a distraught fisherman near Gardner, Montana, Yellowstone National Park's only year-round entrance. The caller claimed he had been fishing on the Yellowstone River when he snagged more than he had bargained for: a human body. The officer stationed at Yellowstone's entrance, a Deputy Bigelow, responded to the call. He and several volunteers waded into the waters and hauled out the corpse, which was missing its head. Bigelow knew a homicide when he saw one, and the county coroner and sheriff were soon on the scene. The victim was a male, wearing only a pair of shorts. His legs had been taken off at the knees, and his arms also taken off at the shoulders. The torso had displayed 27 individual stab wounds, including a giant hole in his chest. What's eerie is there was also no heart. None of the missing body parts were ever recovered as well, and authorities soon began to suspect that they might have found the remains of a 22-year-old man who had been reported missing. James Schlosser had told people that he was traveling to Yellowstone National Park, but had failed to show up to work on a Monday. 2 days and over 1,100 miles away, California Highway Patrol officers responded to a hit-and-run accident near the Big Sur. They eventually tracked down and apprehended one of the suspects, whom immediately offered a confession. "I have a problem," he said. "I am a cannibal." As proof, both men emptied their pockets, which contained human finger bones. The primary suspect was Stanley Dean Baker. Over the course of his interrogation, Baker had admitted to having hitchhiking alone near Yellowstone National Park, where he was picked up by a man in an Opel Kadett sports car, the same vehicle Schlosser had been driving. Baker said Schlosser told him he was on his way to Yellowstone and had invited him to camp with him that evening. And under the cover of darkness, Baker shot Schlosser twice in the head and then took care of the body. He ate the man's heart raw and saved his fingers as a snack for later. Schlosser, who was disposed of in the Yellowstone River, his car used by Baker to make his way to California. And along the way, he had picked up another hitchhiker whom he swore he had not been involved in the murder. Baker's story was corroborated by law enforcement after they had visited the site, which to where he had apparently had camped with Schlosser. They found plenty of evidence, like dried patches of blood, a hunting knife covered in blood, and more bits of the victim, including human bones and fragments and bits of teeth and skin, and even an ear. As if this story wasn't dark enough, Baker claimed his motivation for cannibalizing laid in his long-standing relationship with satanic cults, who had actually recruited him from a college campus in his native Wyoming town. Baker claimed involvement with the mysterious 4-Pi movement, following its alleged establishment by a wealthy California businessman in 1967. The 4-Pi movement was often blamed for the ritualistic deaths of both animals and humans all throughout California. Baker claimed first-hand knowledge of multiple human sacrifices, some of which he had perpetrated, all in the name of the cult's leader, who called himself the Grand Shingon. There is some indication Baker may have also killed another man, San Francisco lighting designer Robert Salem, several months prior to cannibalizing Schlosser. Baker also told police that he, along with his fellow cultists, would not only consume their victims' flesh, but also drink their blood as a part of their satanic ritual. As further proof of his involvement, Baker displayed several tattoos signifying his enrollment in the cult. At the time of his arrest, Baker was carrying LSD and a satanic Bible. He would later claim that his devil worship had played less of a role in his homicidal behavior than the drugs had. In any event, both Baker and his traveling partner were incarcerated. The latter was sentenced to 10 years but released in 2. Baker, on the other hand, received a life sentence. Despite claiming that his odd behavior was drug-induced, Baker continued to act erratically in prison. He threatened the guards and was once caught with a homemade weapon on at least 11 different occasions. He supposedly continued to actively recruit for the cult, soliciting fellow inmates to join. Baker also claimed to be Jesus Christ and that it was not a drug overdose that had killed Jimi Hendrix. He had actually murdered the rock star telepathically from a prison cell in Montana, all with his mind. Despite the heinous nature of his acts, Baker was released in December of 1986 after being deemed rehabilitated enough to re-enter society. He faded into small-town life where he allegedly became a top-performing salesman at a sporting goods store before dying of liver cancer in Minnesota in 1994. And just when you think it couldn't get crazier, Dogman and werewolves get involved. Because during his time in prison, Stanley Dean Baker seemed almost active during the full moon. It was said that the apex of the lunar cycle brought out the worst in him, causing him to howl at the moon like a wild animal. This detail is especially chilling considering Yellowstone's long history of Dogman sightings. Did Baker's cult indoctrination involve delusions or the actual attainment of lycanthropy? In one story shared with the channel Darkness Prevails, a couple of nature lovers decided to spend their holiday in Yellowstone National Park. The boyfriend was hoping to use the opportunity to propose to his girlfriend, Lynn. However, whatever lies in Yellowstone had different plans. They began to notice odd things right away. Within minutes of their first hike, they both heard the sound of something immense crashing through the forest, though nothing was visually observed. As any of us might, they brushed it off as a deer or a moose or a bear, and the couple continued to their campsite. As they're setting up everything, Lynn remarked at how she had spotted a stream nearby and wished to wash her feet. Her old shoes had not done a great job of keeping out the dirt during their hike, and she needed to clean them. The moment they were finished, Lynn rushed to the water's edge quicker than her boyfriend could even reply. While she made her way to the creek, Lynn's boyfriend set up a camping chair. It was a lovely day, and the hike and the campsite had been a bit tiring, and so he soon began to start dozing off. But his nap, though, was cut short when he heard Lynn begin to scream. Wide awake, he leaps up from his chair and dashes to the creek, shouting her name, but when he arrives, she was still by the stream, one shoe on, the other shoe off. Lynn was visibly disturbed. She told him she had been sitting on the bank when a black, hairy shape had landed in the stream beside her. Whatever it was, bounded out again as quickly as it had entered, disappearing into the woods. Lynn didn't get a great look at it, but she was sure that it was big, bigger than her. It gave her the impression that it was a big dog or even a wolf. And while wolves do indeed inhabit Yellowstone, estimates from 2022 suggest fewer than 100 animals even remain in the park. The odds that Lynn would have seen one of these pack animals alone are rather low. Lynn's boyfriend quickly consoled her, leading her back to the campsite where the couple passed the hours until midday, reading and relaxing. They decided it would be fun to catch their own dinner. Lynn's boyfriend suggested that they grab their fishing gear and head off down the trail to a nearby pond that they knew was nearby. It would only take them about 10 or so minutes to get there on foot. Almost as an afterthought, Lynn's boyfriend realized that the pond might even be a good place to propose, so he tucked the engagement ring in his pocket, and the couple set off along the path, tackle box and fishing rods in hand. As the pond came into view, however, both campers were stopped in their tracks by a growling noise. It sounded like something waiting in the undergrowth on the path ahead. The couple tried to decide on what it was and what they should do. Was it a bear? Was it a wolf? Should they throw a rock? Lynn's boyfriend decided that the wisest course of action was to try and frighten off whatever it was making himself look bigger, waving his arms and shouting. In response, the animal stood up from the tall weeds, revealing a shaggy canine head. It was indeed a wolf. There was no mistaking it as a bear. Lynn had dropped her fishing rod in terror. Neither of them had ever felt the urge of fight or flight before, but they felt the urge to freeze. As they stared on this in disbelief, the head continued its ascent higher than any wolf's would have, until it towered more than 6 feet above the ground, attached to a massive hairy body. It wasn't a wolf, because this thing was standing upright. And slowly, this thing stepped from its place beside the path in an odd sideways motion towards a small tree. One of its arms reached out to steady itself on the trunk, where it stood for a few seconds before noisily stalking off into the forest. When the sound had finally subsided, Lynn asked her boyfriend what they had just seen. He had no idea, despite being an avid outdoorsman. At any rate, the fishing trip was off. The couple wisely decided to return to camp. As they turned around to leave, the sound of footsteps returned, louder and closer, heavier than before. They both dropped everything in their hands and ran as fast as they could, not affording a single moment to look behind them. No longer was the campsite their destination. All they wanted to do was escape. The footsteps continued to pursue the couple as they raced towards safety. And luckily, the sound seemed to stop after they passed their tent. They could only hope that maybe the creature had been distracted by their belongings. Regardless, both Lynn and her boyfriend felt that the safest thing to do was to continue to the car as quickly as they could, an act which took them 45 minutes. They sped away, exhausted, leaving behind all of their camping gear. Despite this loss, it was easily the best decision, and Lynn's boyfriend thanked his lucky stars that he still had the engagement ring in his pocket. Today, the couple is married and expecting their first, but still vividly remember their terrifying encounter with a dogman. A handful of evidence points to the fact that while the few wolves remaining in and around Yellowstone National Park may not be full-fledged dogmen, they certainly exhibit peculiar characteristics. In 2017, park visitor Siddharth Gandhi recorded a chilling interaction on a road passing through Yellowstone's Lamar Valley. The video shows a large black wolf which seems entirely unafraid as it passes in and out of his car's headlights. The absence of a pack, along with the animal's peculiar behavior and large size, have led some viewers to speculate this was not merely a wolf, but something more sinister. A surviving member of an extinct direwolf species, or perhaps even a shapeshifter or werewolf. Almost a full year later and over 150 miles to the north, a rural Montana rancher near Denton shot and killed an odd canine that was harassing his livestock. The creature looked wolf-like, but its proportions seemed all wrong. Its ears were too big, its legs too short, its claws and head too large. While DNA analysis later revealed it to be a gray wolf, anyone who looks at the pictures of the creature can tell it is, at the very least, an aberrant member of its species. The 2018 Denton wolf actually finds precedent in another strange creature that was shot and killed by settler Israel Hutchins in Montana's Madison Valley in the late 19th century. It reportedly issued unnatural wails every night and was seen snapping a half-inch rope with one bite. Hutchins traded the creature's body for a cow owned by Joseph Sherwood. Unlike the other figures throughout the cryptozoological history, Sherwood had the forethought to preserve and mount the specimen. Sherwood displayed the beast in various stores and small exhibitions through the region under various names. Yet, for over a century, the trophy was somehow lost, and all cryptozoologists could do was marvel over photographs of the creature which clearly showed a shaggy, thin-limbed creature with a sloping back and a narrow snout. It looked more like a hyena than any North American wolf species. Researchers Lauren Coleman and Jerome Clark speculated that the specimen might represent the Shunkaworakin, a mysterious canine from indigenous legend which reputedly invaded villages at nightfall to steal dogs. Finally, Jack Kirby, Hutchinson's grandson, tracked down the creature down to the Idaho Museum of Natural History in 2008. Modern photography reveals that, although it still appears quite strange, the creature looks much more like a wolf than the earlier pictures indicated. As of 2008, the specimen was on display at the Madison Valley History Museum. The organization seemed resistant to Coleman and Clark's suggestion that they perform a DNA test on the creature, perhaps because they felt mundane results might diminish the exhibit's mystery. Researcher RD6 Killer Clark specializes in the collection of indigenous American stories surrounding what they refer to as star people, the term many tribes use when describing the beings seen in the conjunction with UFOs. Over the course of her investigations, she has recorded dozens of sightings from First Nations people, their testimony straddling the line between modern flying saucer sightings and the myths and legends of their ancestors. One of Clark's informants lived just over the Montana border in Idaho. He was hesitant to share his story, but eventually agreed after he promised to use the pseudonym Bill. Bill said he would only tell his story once, and sometime in the early 2000s, Bill and his cousins Mark, 3 Elk, and Charlie Blue had decided to spend some time hunting elk in the Togwotee Mountains near Jackson Hole, Wyoming. Jackson Hole sits famously between the Grand Teton and Yellowstone National Parks, and the Togwotee area is only around 30 miles from Yellowstone's border as the crow flies. The plan was to stay in the mountains for a week or until one of them shot an elk, whichever came first. The trio of hunters set off on their horses toward their excursion's destination, an area known as Lyman Ridge. Once there, they separated, agreeing to reconvene before nightfall. Bill was the first to return, and after several more moments, he began to grow concerned regarding his cousin's whereabouts as the sun was rapidly setting. He was just setting off to search for them when he saw a circular, brilliantly lit craft descend from the sky into the valley below. At first, he thought his eyes must be playing tricks on him, but Bill's cousins arrived within moments, and he could tell from the look on their faces that they too had seen it, the UFO. The men decided to walk the ridgeline for a better look, eventually finding where the craft had landed. It wasn't far from them now, perhaps 100 feet, and the hunters shuffled forward on their stomachs to the cliff's edge, where they watched the scene through their rifle scopes for over a half hour. Mark and Charlie suggested they shoot at the vehicle, but Bill insisted this was a bad idea. Who knew what would happen, and furthermore, doing so would only draw unnecessary attention. Bill said that they should instead return to camp, eat dinner, go to bed, and forget about the entire thing. Bill got up to leave, and as he stood, he saw something remarkable. "If I live 1,000 years, I will never forget it," he told Clark. From an opening on the craft, an immense carcass of a bison unceremoniously fell to the ground. All 3 men followed suit, returning to a prone position and readying their rifles. It was almost impossible to keep their scopes steady as their hearts raced and adrenaline coursing through their systems. Bill, Mark, and Charlie watched and waited, fingers on their triggers, ready to defend themselves. Nothing further happened. At last, the lights on the ship began to rotate and the craft jetted into the sky, leaving the hunters cloaked in darkness. They simply stood up, returned to camp, and went to sleep without discussing anything. While this may seem illogical, similar behavior is reported consistently across UFO witnesses who often find themselves acting strangely after their encounters. It wasn't until morning that the conversation turned to the spaceship and the bison. Bill was now eager to discuss what they had seen, and it took everything within his power not to rouse his cousins or go off and investigate the landing site on his own. Instead, Bill waited patiently for Mark and Charlie to wake up, using this time to fry up some bacon in a skillet. Once his cousins awoke, he shared his plan for the morning and suggested that they investigate the valley where the UFO had landed. After breakfast, they searched the area, and it wasn't long before they had stumbled upon the carcass. They were, as Bills later put it, shocked beyond words. The bison was a pregnant female and had been horrendously mutilated. Empty eye sockets stared back at the hunters. The mother bison had neither its ears nor its tail. Her stomach had been carved, revealing the calf inside, whose eyes and genitals were also missing as well. The placenta could not be found. Had this poor creature been abducted from Yellowstone National Park? Estimates of the park's bison population sit between 2,300 to 5,500 individuals. It seemed a likely explanation. The hunters fought off the urge to report the incident to the game warden. No one would believe their fantastic story, meaning blame would inevitably fall upon them, along with time behind bars and a hefty fine. This, in addition to how disturbing the sight had been, was the reason behind Bill's secrecy. He concluded his story to Clark with a few chilling thoughts, saying this: The old-timers used to talk about the star people. Sometimes they came to the sweat lodges of our elders, traveling the stars and visiting these star people. When they returned, they told us wondrous tales of our ancestors. As a boy, I never understood it. As a man, I grew up to believe that it was true. I was in the sweat lodge when miraculous things would happen because of the star people. And now, when I close my eyes and I see the carcass of the mother buffalo and her calf, I know they are not the helpers, the ancestors. These are a different group of star people, and maybe we really should be worried about them. That's going to do it for today's episode, you guys. If you enjoy this, be sure to leave a comment down below, and don't forget to like this video. Also, if you're new to the channel, be sure to go ahead and smack that subscribe button and keep your notifications turned on, so YouTube will hopefully let you know every time I release a great new video. As always, guys, keep an open mind. I love you all, and I'll see you guys in the very next video.